We've all heard legends, seen paintings, and watched movies about knights, but just how much has their story been dramatized for entertainment? What role did knights actually play in history? Hi, I'm Rich Burnett for Wondrium. In this episode of Perspectives, you'll hear from several experts who cover knights' battlefield dominance, their behavior, and several of the well-known orders. We'll also hear about the events that led to the end of the knight's reign. We begin now in the Middle Ages, when the heavily armored figure of the knight came into prominence.
During the Middle Ages, horsemen increasingly came to be regarded as the decisive factor in warfare. By the 11th century, the figure of the knight, a highly trained warrior mounted on a huge war horse and completely encased in heavy armor, had emerged as the ultimate force on the battlefield.
They were both admired and feared. It's because of his status that Chaucer gives his knight, his knecht, pride of place in the Canterbury Tales by making him the first of his storytellers. A knecht there was, and that a worthy man, that fra the time that he first began to ridden out, he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy.
In terms of people, as we open our period, there was still a sense of the division into three different types synonymous with the Middle Ages. Those who fight, monarchs and nobles, those who pray, the clergy, and those who work, everyone else. This so-called three orders theory, although articulated in medieval sources themselves, was always more idealized than real. There was tremendous diversity within each order, for example. A king wasn't the same as an unemployed knight seeking a patron, even though they both fought. A mounted knight rode into battle on horseback, fully armored and mail. He could clash with an opposing army from atop his horse, or he might dismount, either voluntarily or at the hands of his enemy, and then proceed to engage his foes in hand-to-hand combat. Our knight fought with a broadsword in one hand and defended himself with a wooden shield in the other. Although he rode with his comrades, he was essentially fighting as an individual, relying on his own strength and skills in hopes of winning personal glory.
And there was a great demand for soldiers in the Middle Ages. The wars known as the Crusades lasted for 3 centuries. We'll talk about them later. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted from 1337 to 1453, well over 100 years, in fact. And then there were the constant squabbles between rival barons, each of whom had his private army incorporating a number of knights. They offered their services to their superiors, who rewarded them with land, which peasants then cultivated on their behalf.
A formation of these knights thundering towards you with lowered spears, literally shaking the ground, was a terrifying sight, and many who witnessed it simply turned and fled. So, while conventional wisdom during the Middle Ages dictated that the army who had the most knights would win the battle, there was a catch. Knights were horrifically expensive. To properly use all the complicated equipment required prospective knights to begin their training during boyhood.
So, you want to become a knight. Let me warn you, it's every bit as tough as becoming a US Marine. You also have to be of noble birth, preferably the eldest son of a knight himself. There's another problem. You have to start your training at around the age of 7, which probably rules out most patrons of the great courses. If you're not the eldest son, by the way, you'll probably enter the church. That's another way to become rich and powerful. If you do fit the criteria I've just listed, however, Your father will pack you off to a nobleman's house, perhaps to a relative like an uncle, where you'll serve as his page. You'll learn how to ride, how to behave in polite society, and how to fight with a wooden sword. You'll also learn how to carry a lady's train so it doesn't touch the ground. Very important, that. We see pages doing their stuff at royal weddings and coronations. Then, around the age of 14, you'll become a squire. That's to say, you'll become the personal attendant of a knight. The word squire comes from the French écuyer, meaning shield carrier, because that was one of your main duties, carrying a knight's shield and spear. You have to look after your knight's horse and armor and serve him his meat at the table when he's feasting. You also learn courtly manners and how to conduct yourself in the presence of ladies. It all sounds very proper, but boys will be boys, and some squires did go off the rails. We hear of rival gangs of squires burning down half of Boston, a town on the east coast of England, in 1288. Your training now includes fighting with a sword and buckler. A buckler was a small round shield, throwing the javelin, putting, as it's called, or throwing stones, fighting with quarterstaves, and so on. You fight alongside your knight in battle and assist him if he's wounded. At the end of your period of training, at about 21, you're ready to be knighted yourself. This is a very solemn ceremony. First, you fast and pray in the chapel. Then you make your confession to a priest and kneel before your lord, or perhaps before your king, in full armor, but without your helmet on. You swear an oath of loyalty, which includes the words, "Sire, I become your man." Your lord then dubs you a knight by laying his sword briefly on each of your shoulders and on your neck. This symbolizes the fact that he could, if he chose, take your life. He also presents you with a white sword belt, a token of your purity, and a pair of gold spurs. You now carry the arms and wear the protective chainmail armor of a knight.
And maintaining their martial skills as adults amounted to a full-time job. Thus, knights had to be fed, housed, and supported entirely by the labor of others. Additionally, to just manufacture all the weapons and armor needed to equip a knight represented an enormous outlay of resources and demanded hundreds of hours of labor by an expert blacksmith. Finally, those specialized war horses that the knights rode into battle were themselves extremely expensive to purchase, to train, and to keep, and each knight required several more horses. Converting medieval prices into modern ones is always a problematic endeavor, but it's been estimated that obtaining all of the equipment and horses for just one knight amounted to several thousand times the annual wage of a skilled medieval craftsman. Of course, maintaining the knight, along with his entourage of assistants, would be a substantial additional ongoing expense. In light of all this, not surprisingly, only the very wealthiest could afford to be knights, and knighthood itself soon became associated with the uppermost social stratum of land-owning noblemen.
In the book of the Order of Chivalry, which was written by a certain Raymond Lull in 1276, you were expected to defend, I quote, women, widows, orphans, the sick and the weak, and those who work on the land. Well, did knights actually display such admirable virtues to widows, orphans, and the like? Well, sometimes, no doubt, but by no means invariably. Both on the battlefield and off it, infringements of the code of chivalry were commonplace. Some knights scorned those who were weak and defenseless, were foul-mouthed and abusive towards women, and acted brutally towards their enemies.
At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, hoping to stop up what he, along with many clergy and pilgrims, thought was a crack in the dam of church power. Urban set the tone for all the Crusades to follow, drawing on the deep traditions of othering and demonology to gin up enthusiasm for war. He called the Turks an accursed race, utterly alienated from God. Between 1096 and 99, Urban's Christian knights convened at Constantinople and fought to claim Nicaea, Dorylaeum, and eventually Antioch. These were sites central to sacred narrative and institutional power alike. And this reminds us of how important controlling history and place is to sacred violence. With holy war, this reclamation is seen as spreading the will of the divine sovereign in an earthly campaign that contributes to the cosmic one. There was also a shift in battlefield ethics that's illustrative. As religion scholar Charles Kimball notes, Christian soldiers were once expected to atone for any killing that they did. But with the Crusades, they displayed Muslim heads like trophies and understood that on some level, they were actually expiating their sins by fighting. That's a big shift. The Turks weren't even in control of Jerusalem any longer by the time Crusaders arrived, nor apparently was there much friction between the different religious groups that worshipped there. But nonetheless, Crusaders indiscriminately killed city dwellers after they breached the gates in July 1099. According to the historical account chronicled by Raymond de Vagile, they burned the Great Synagogue and sacked the Temple Mount. After Muslims worshipping there fled into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they had to pay ransom to get out, and despite this, they were slaughtered upon their exit. Subsequent crusades hardened this kind of mindset, but they were extremely inconsistent in terms of the church's military success.
A Templar was an utterly new kind of knight, in that he was also a monk. It was one thing for the Pope to send secular fighting men to defend and protect the church through force of arms. It was quite another for him to sanction an order of monks who were given license to act like knights. The Knights Templar were initially founded by a man named Hugh of Payne, along with 8 companions around 1118. And their stated goal was to offer protection to pilgrims who were traveling to Jerusalem. They did this not only by serving as a kind of bodyguard for those pilgrims passing through Palestine, but also by cleverly coming up with a way to remove the need for pilgrims to carry a lot of money and other valuables with them. They came up with a very modern idea, which was essentially a very early form of the ATM. A pilgrim traveling to the Holy Land could deposit his money at one of the Templar strongholds to be found throughout the European West. The amount he had deposited was then inscribed in code on a piece of vellum or parchment, which could be decoded only by a member of the order on the other end, in Jerusalem. The pilgrim could then withdraw the amount of money he had deposited before his pilgrimage once he had arrived at his final destination. As a further mark of their high and unusual status, the king of Jerusalem at the time, Baldwin II, gave them as their headquarters part of the royal enclosure on the Temple Mount, hence the name Templar. Perhaps even more importantly, one of the most important religious figures of the day, Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk and abbot, further legitimized them by writing rules for their order, and the Templars adopted as a uniform the white robe of the Cistercians with a red cross emblazoned on the front. At the height of their existence, it is estimated that there were about 20,000 Templars divided roughly into 3 groups: the Knights, responsible for overseeing the safety and security of pilgrims in the Holy Land; priests, who attended to the religious needs of the order; and commoners, who helped with the day-to-day running of the Templars' quite lucrative banking empire. They soon amassed wealth and power on a massive scale, something that worried many rulers, particularly the King of France, and this in turn led to their persecution and the eventual dissolution of their order in the 14th century, a fact which meant that their property and money could be confiscated and enrich the coffers of others, particularly the French monarchy. This has also meant that any number of conspiracy theorists have been on the hunt for the so-called Templar treasure, and people like the writer Dan Brown have made something like $1 billion writing books like The Da Vinci Code. And let me just pause here and tell you, I really don't think there is a vast secret Templar order still in existence that is pulling strings and levers all over the world, because if there were, humanity would be in much better shape than it seems to be at the moment. But still, one could always hope, and that's the point, right? The Templars were not the only new order of knights to be created as a direct result of the Crusades. Two others, the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Knights, are worth mentioning. The Knights Hospitaller were formed around the same time and out of the same impulse as that which led to the founding of the Knights Templar, namely to offer assistance to pilgrims who had traveled to the Holy Land. While the Templars focused more on protecting pilgrims from theft or violence, the Hospitallers concentrated on caring for those who became ill while in Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, since the journey to Jerusalem was arduous and many people set out on pilgrimage for the express purpose of seeking relief from various ailments and afflictions, there was a significant need for medical assistance for many of those pilgrims who eventually made it to Jerusalem. The Hospitallers venerated poverty, subjecting themselves to the extremes of an impoverished life. But in contrast, they treated all of the sick in their hospitals, no matter their rank or status, as if they were great lords or noblemen. Of particular note are the lavish and rich diets all patients were fed. The Hospital of St. John was run on a staggering scale, with enough beds for 2,000 patients, and it had wards that divided the sick by gender and even by medical specialty. For example, one of the wards seems to have been devoted to obstetrics. Within 50 years of their founding, the Knights Hospitaller, like the Knights Templar, had become a military order of monk knights, with a division of ranks: those who tended to the ill in the hospital and those who fought on behalf of the order. While the Templars wore a white tunic with a red cross, the Knights Hospitaller were easily identified by their black tunics and white crosses. The last of the new orders of knighthood to result from the Crusades were the Teutonic Knights. This order was established later than the Templars and the Hospitallers, closer to the end of the 12th century. But again, like the other two orders, the impetus for their existence came from a desire to help those in need. In this case, the Teutonic Knights set themselves the task of caring specifically for injured crusaders.
The age of chivalry lasted from about 1100 to 1500. Long before that, however, knights in armour were becoming militarily obsolete. Chaucer's knight is already one of a dying breed. It's estimated that in his day there were no more than 1,000 knights in the whole of England, supported by about 3 times as many squires. That was down from 6,000 knights in the reign of Henry II, 1154 to 1189. One of the factors that had brought about a reduction in their ranks was a phenomenon that derived from the other side of history, the common soldier, provided with nothing more sophisticated than a longbow and a quiver full of arrows. The first battle to be decided by the longbow was Crécy in 1346, which the English won against the French. It's been estimated that in the first 5 minutes of the battle, the English bowmen were able to unleash 5,000 arrows, thereby creating havoc in the ranks of French knights.
The longbow, used with great success by the English in the 100 Years' War, even became a point of national pride. And the English boasted the skill and training required to fire it effectively. In 1549, English Bishop Hugh Latimer proclaimed, "Men shall never shoot the longbow well, except that they be brought up in it." The pull of the longbow was 80 pounds, requiring noteworthy strength as well. Heavily armored pikemen also filled the king's ranks, tightly packed into formation. Unlike our noble knight, the role of the pikeman was largely defensive and required almost no training. These pikemen would place the butt of their weapons into the ground, sticking out from the earth at a 45-degree angle. And then they would prop them on the backs of the men in front of them. Their ranks were virtually impenetrable by enemy cavalry and infantry. By the early 16th century, Swiss, Spanish, German, and Italian armies had shortened the pikes and developed complex maneuvers to utilize pikemen offensively. These operations required more extensive drilling to ensure that the troops moved properly within their formations. South of the Alps, as we know, feudalism didn't feature prominently, although lordship did. During the Italian Renaissance, courtiers were expected to perform military service as part of their wide skill set devoted to the service of their princes. Mercenaries were far more in evidence in the South as republics prosecuted their wars, and mercenary captains, condottieri, gained fame, wealth, and even political authority for their abilities on the battlefield. So now let's fast forward. The soldier of the mid-17th century was a far different specimen than the warriors we've just been tracking. No longer the loyal knight or courtier of Renaissance kings and princes, nor the older-style mercenaries serving the republics, this later soldier was in many ways a tool for the early modern state. He wasn't born to military pursuits, but instead found himself either joining voluntarily in hopes of bettering his personal condition, or being forced to enter service because of his meager station in life, or perhaps because a criminal past limited his opportunities. Even soldiers for hire weren't drawn from the upper tiers of society or in possession of any lengthy preparation for a career in the military. Our soldier's training was condensed. He didn't need substantial skills to use his weapons, and most of his exercises involved drilling to ensure precise movement in formation with his fellow soldiers. As an individual, our soldier wouldn't be a particularly effective weapon. His success was instead dependent on his unit as a whole. Muskets and arquebuses had replaced bows and arrows, and even a tripod was used to steady the gun. Still, these firearms were inaccurate. A smooth bore and a round shot meant that even perfectly aimed projectiles took often wildly unpredictable paths. Taking the time to aim carefully and then fire was largely a wasted effort, so training troops in how to use these weapons was relatively limited. Nearly anyone could fire these weapons with virtually the same effect. Officers were still drawn from the highest social ranks, but military service had ceased to be the privilege of the elites.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the topics in this episode, the full list of series that these clips came from is in the description below. You can watch them all on Wondrium. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel for new episodes of Perspectives, and you can watch previous ones here.